There was a time when their names alone could sell out entire arenas. Tens of thousands showed up. Radios played them nonstop. Nashville needed them. Then, quietly, everything stopped. No farewell tour, no final headline, just silence. This video explores 10 country icons who once stood at the very center of the spotlight, only to watch it fade while they were still alive. From packed arenas to total obscurity, these are the stories the industry chose to forget. Tanya Tucker. At just 13 years old, Tanya Tucker walked onto the country music stage and never looked back. By the early 1970s, she wasn't just a prodigy, she was a phenomenon. Her voice sounded lived in, wounded, and impossibly mature for her age. Within a few years, she was headlining major tours, selling out large venues, and competing with the biggest names Nashville had to offer. Few artists in country history rose that fast, that young, and with that much industry backing. During her peak years, Tucker was everywhere. Her records dominated radio, her concerts filled arenas, and her name carried real weight inside Music Row. She wasn't a novelty act or a short-term curiosity. She was positioned as a long-term star, someone who would define the genre for decades. At a time when country music still revolved around personality and voice, Tanya Tucker had both in abundance. But the decline didn't arrive with a single scandal or career-ending moment. It crept in slowly. As the industry shifted its image expectations and radio became less forgiving, Tucker found herself increasingly out of step with Nashville's comfort zone. Her personal life became fodder for whispers, and those whispers quietly replaced airplay. Tours grew smaller. Invitations stopped coming. The arenas that once sold out stopped calling altogether. What makes her story especially painful is that she didn't disappear. She was still recording, still performing, still capable of delivering the same raw emotion that made her famous. But the industry had moved on without ever formally saying goodbye. For years, Tanya Tucker existed in a strange limbo, too famous to be unknown, yet too ignored to be relevant. She watched an entire generation of fans grow up without hearing her name on the radio that once relied on her. By the time many listeners realized she was gone, she had already been gone for years. Not physically, but professionally. The spotlight didn't explode or crash. It simply dimmed until it vanished. Tucker's journey from sold-out arenas to near obscurity stands as one of the clearest examples of how quietly country music can erase even its brightest stars. Gary Stewart. For a brief but unforgettable moment, Gary Stewart stood at the very heart of outlaw country. In the mid-1970s, his voice cut through the genre like a blade, raw, aching, and brutally honest. While others leaned into polish, Stewart sounded broken in the most authentic way possible. His records sold fast, his shows filled large venues, and his name carried serious credibility among fans who believed country music should hurt a little to be real. At his peak, Gary Stewart wasn't a fringe artist. He was moving serious units, headlining tours, and sharing stages with the biggest names of the era. His songs didn't just chart, they connected. There was something dangerously sincere about him, a sense that what he sang wasn't performance but confession. For a time, that honesty made him indispensable to the outlaw movement and impossible for Nashville to ignore. But the very qualities that fueled his rise also made him difficult to contain. As country music began to drift toward cleaner images and safer personalities, Stewart no longer fit the picture. There was no dramatic blacklist, no public exile. Instead, the support quietly thinned out. Radio play slowed, promotion softened. The industry didn't reject him outright. It simply stopped leaning in. Unlike artists who reinvent themselves to survive, Stewart stayed exactly who he was. He kept recording, he kept touring, but the rooms grew smaller, the budgets shrank, the calls came less often. By the 1980s, the arenas were gone, replaced by clubs and short runs that barely registered outside loyal fan circles. To the mainstream audience, Gary Stewart had simply vanished. What makes his fall especially haunting is how little noise it made. There was no farewell tour, no retrospective celebration, no official closing chapter. He lived long enough to watch his own era become history and his name fade from the conversation. Younger fans discovered outlaw country without ever hearing about one of its most honest voices. Gary Stewart didn't lose everything overnight. He lost it gradually, through silence, indifference, and the slow erosion of relevance. From sold-out venues to near total obscurity, his story captures how unforgiving country music can be to artists who refuse to soften their edges, even when those edges once made them stars. Johnny Rodriguez. In the early 1970s, Johnny Rodriguez was one of the fastest rising stars country music had ever seen. His ascent was not gradual, it was explosive. Within a short span of time, he stacked multiple #1 hits, sold massive numbers of records, and headlined large venues across the country. For a brief moment, Nashville treated him as more than just a successful singer. He was positioned as a generational figure, a symbol of a changing country music audience. At his peak, Rodriguez's appeal cut deep. His voice carried heartbreak and vulnerability, and his songs resonated with working-class listeners who heard their own struggles reflected back at them. Concerts filled quickly. Radio leaned heavily on his singles. He wasn't opening for stars. He was the star. In an era crowded with legends, Johnny Rodriguez carved out space that felt secure and permanent. But his fall didn't come with a defining crash. There was no single record that failed spectacularly, no headline-grabbing controversy that forced him out. Instead, the momentum slowed almost imperceptibly. The hits stopped landing at the top. Radio programmers began choosing newer names. Tour routing changed. Without warning, the arena dates vanished and were replaced with smaller halls, then fewer dates altogether. What makes Rodriguez's story especially stark is how quickly the industry moved on. Only a few years separated his chart dominance from his near invisibility. Nashville didn't publicly abandon him. It simply stopped investing in him. The silence was professional, efficient, and devastating. His name faded from playlists and award conversations, while he was still capable of delivering the same emotional performances that once sold out rooms. For years afterward, Johnny Rodriguez remained active, recording and performing when opportunities allowed. But the spotlight never returned. A generation of new country fans grew up unaware that he had once been one of the genre's most reliable hitmakers. His songs survived quietly among longtime listeners, but his presence in the broader narrative of country music all but disappeared. Rodriguez's journey from sold-out arenas to obscurity is a reminder of how quickly success can be rewritten out of history. Not because it wasn't real, but because the industry rarely looks back once it decides the future belongs to someone else. He didn't collapse under scandal or self-destruction. He was simply left behind. Crystal Gayle. For much of the late 1970s and early 1980s, Crystal Gayle represented country music at its most elegant and commercially powerful. She wasn't just successful, she was everywhere. Her smooth, restrained vocal style crossed genre lines effortlessly, bringing country music into pop arenas that few artists had access to at the time. Her concerts filled large venues, her records sold in enormous numbers, and her image became instantly recognizable to audiences far beyond Nashville. At her peak, Gayle occupied a rare position. She was embraced by traditional country fans, while simultaneously welcomed by pop radio and television. That crossover success translated into sold-out arenas and a level of visibility most country artists never reach. She wasn't chasing trends, she was the trend. For several years, Crystal Gayle felt untouchable, carefully positioned as a long-term pillar of the genre's future. But the shift came quietly. As country music hardened its lines and pop crossover became less fashionable, the very sound that once made her indispensable became a liability. There was no dramatic fallout, no scandal to explain her retreat from the spotlight. Instead, radio slowly cooled. Promotion softened. The industry's enthusiasm moved elsewhere, toward newer faces and louder styles. What followed was not a collapse, but a gradual erasure. Arena tours stopped appearing on the calendar. Media attention thinned out. While Gayle continued recording and performing, the scale of her career shrank steadily. She transitioned from headlining major venues to performing for loyal fans in smaller settings, largely outside the mainstream conversation that once revolved around her. The most striking part of Crystal Gayle's story is how cleanly the industry disengaged. There was no farewell moment acknowledging her contributions, no final chapter written while the public was still watching. She remained active, capable, and professional, yet increasingly invisible to newer audiences. Country music moved forward without formally closing the door behind her. By the time many listeners realized she was no longer part of the mainstream, years had already passed. A generation grew up hearing her name only as a footnote, unaware that she once stood at the center of sold-out arenas and cross-genre dominance. Her decline wasn't fueled by excess or controversy. It was the result of changing tastes and an industry that rarely waits. Crystal Gayle's journey shows how even polished, successful careers can fade into obscurity when the spotlight moves on. In country music, longevity isn't guaranteed by talent or success, only by relevance. And once relevance slips away, the silence can be absolute. Eddie Raven. For much of the late 1970s and 1980s, Eddie Raven was exactly what Nashville wanted. He was reliable, polished, and commercially sharp. His songs climbed the charts with consistency, his albums sold well, and his tours drew large crowds across the country. Raven wasn't positioned as a risky outsider or a passing trend. He was treated as a stable hitmaker, the kind of artist labels believed would always have a place in the system. At his height, Eddie Raven belonged on big stages. His singles dominated radio rotation, and his name appeared regularly on tour posters alongside the era's biggest stars. There was confidence in his career path. He fit the format, understood the industry, and delivered exactly what was expected of a mainstream country star. For a time, it felt like his success was sustainable, even permanent. But unlike dramatic downfalls fueled by scandal or rebellion, Raven's decline came through something far quieter: irrelevance by evolution. As country music shifted its sound and marketing priorities, the industry's appetite for his style slowly disappeared. Radio programmers leaned toward younger faces. Labels chased sharper images. Without warning, Eddie Raven's steady presence began to feel dated to a system obsessed with what came next. The change wasn't announced. It happened through absence. His singles received less airplay. Tour offers shrank in size and frequency. Arena dates gave way to theaters, then to smaller regional venues. There was no public explanation, no closing statement. Nashville didn't push him out. It simply stopped pulling him forward. What makes Raven's story particularly unsettling is how little resistance the system showed. He continued working, continued recording, and continued performing with the same professionalism that built his career. Yet those efforts existed largely outside the spotlight. To newer fans, his name meant nothing. To the industry, he became part of the past without ceremony. By the time the silence fully settled in, Eddie Raven had already lost the scale that once defined his success. The sold-out arenas were gone, replaced by a career sustained only by loyal listeners who remembered his peak. His disappearance from mainstream country happened without noise, without conflict, and without acknowledgement. Eddie Raven's journey underscores a harsh truth about country music. Even artists who play by the rules are not protected. When the format changes and attention shifts, consistency can become invisibility. From a dependable arena-level star to near total obscurity, his career faded not because he failed, but because the industry decided it was finished listening. Moe Bandy. For a long stretch of the late 1970s and early 1980s, Moe Bandy was one of the most dependable draws in country music. His sound was unapologetically traditional, rooted in honky-tonk heartbreak and working-class realism. Fans showed up in massive numbers because they knew exactly what they were getting. His records sold consistently, his singles charted reliably, and his tours filled large venues across the country. Moe Bandy wasn't chasing trends. He was representing the core of what country music claimed to stand for. At his peak, Bandy belonged on big stages. His name carried weight with promoters, radio programmers, and audiences who valued authenticity over polish. He wasn't positioned as a crossover star, but he didn't need to be. His success came from loyalty. People trusted him, and that trust translated into sold-out shows and a steady presence in the upper tier of the genre. The decline didn't come suddenly. It arrived as the industry itself began changing direction. As country music leaned harder into pop production and image-driven marketing, Bandy's traditionalism quietly lost its seat at the table. Radio didn't reject him outright. It simply began favoring artists who looked and sounded more compatible with the new direction. Slowly, his singles stopped landing. The rotation faded. The momentum evaporated. What followed was a steady shrinking of scale. Arena dates disappeared. Major tours stopped materializing. Moe Bandy continued performing, often relentlessly, but the settings changed. Large venues were replaced by smaller halls, then regional circuits, then appearances that barely registered outside his most devoted fan base. He was still working, still capable, still true to his sound. But the spotlight no longer followed. The most striking part of Bandy's story is how invisible the transition was. There was no moment where the industry acknowledged what it was leaving behind. No farewell era. No recognition that one of its most reliable traditional voices had been pushed to the margins. He didn't implode. He didn't self-destruct. He simply stayed the same while everything around him moved on. By the time a new generation of country fans came along, Moe Bandy was already missing from the conversation. Many never knew that he once packed venues and helped define an era. His career didn't end. It narrowed, quietly and permanently. Moe Bandy's journey from sold-out arenas to near obscurity reveals a brutal truth. In country music, authenticity alone does not guarantee survival. When the industry decides tradition no longer sells, even its most faithful representatives can be left behind without a sound. John Conlee. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, John Conlee's voice was impossible to miss. It wasn't flashy or theatrical. It was calm, conversational, and devastatingly honest. That restraint made him stand out in a genre built on storytelling. His songs connected deeply with adult listeners, and that connection translated into serious commercial power. Conlee wasn't a background presence. He was selling records, filling large venues, and standing comfortably among country music's most respected headliners. At his peak, Conlee represented a specific kind of stardom Nashville valued at the time. He was mature, dependable, and emotionally precise. Radio embraced him. His singles climbed steadily, and his concerts drew crowds who came to listen, not just cheer. In an era where lyrics mattered, John Conlee's songs felt like quiet conversations between the artist and the audience. That intimacy worked at scale, even in arenas. But his decline didn't follow a dramatic arc. There was no public collapse, no scandal that forced him out. Instead, the genre changed around him. As country music shifted toward louder production, younger imagery, and sharper branding, Conlee's subtlety became a disadvantage. Radio didn't ban him. It simply moved on. His sound, once perfectly aligned with the format, suddenly felt out of step with what programmers wanted to push. The change revealed itself through absence. Fewer singles received meaningful airplay. Tour opportunities shrank. Arena shows faded from his schedule and were replaced by smaller, more selective engagements. Conlee continued recording and performing with the same discipline that built his career, but the industry's attention was no longer there to amplify his work. What makes his story particularly striking is how little acknowledgement accompanied his disappearance. John Conlee didn't burn bridges. He didn't alienate fans or labels. He simply aged into irrelevance in a system obsessed with the next version of country music. While newer artists were aggressively marketed, Conlee's name quietly slipped out of the conversation. By the time a new generation of listeners discovered country music, many had never heard of him. Few realized that his voice once anchored sold-out venues and defined an era of emotionally restrained storytelling. His songs lived on among longtime fans, but his presence in the mainstream narrative was gone. John Conlee's journey from major stages to near obscurity illustrates one of country music's coldest truths. Even artists who do everything right can be erased when their style no longer fits the moment. Success does not guarantee remembrance. Sometimes, it only guarantees that the fall will be silent. Lee Greenwood. For a period in the early to mid-1980s, Lee Greenwood stood at a level of visibility few country artists ever reach. His music wasn't just popular, it was everywhere. He headlined large venues, appeared on major television broadcasts, and became a fixture at high-profile events where country music intersected with national identity. Greenwood wasn't simply a successful artist. He was a symbol, and symbols sell out arenas. At his peak, Greenwood's concerts drew massive crowds. Promoters trusted his name, radio relied on his presence, and Nashville treated him as an essential part of the genre's public image. His career felt unusually secure because it was tied to something larger than trends. He wasn't just riding a moment. He appeared to represent permanence. But that perception turned out to be fragile. As the industry shifted and country music began chasing new sounds and younger audiences, Greenwood's positioning became increasingly narrow. The same identity that once amplified his success started to limit it. His music remained recognizable, but radio interest cooled. Without broad format support, the scale of his career began to shrink. The decline wasn't explosive. There was no scandal, no public fall from grace. It happened through gradual isolation. Arena tours disappeared. Major label momentum slowed. Greenwood continued performing, often at patriotic events and specialized venues, but the mainstream spotlight no longer followed him. To Nashville, he had become situational rather than central. What makes Greenwood's story unsettling is how quickly an artist so visible could slide into the margins. He was still active, still respected, still capable of commanding a stage. Yet his role in country music's ongoing narrative diminished sharply. Newer fans encountered his name without understanding how dominant he once was. Over time, his career narrowed into a specific lane that lacked the reach and relevance of his peak years. The sold-out arenas became memories rather than expectations. His disappearance from the broader industry conversation wasn't accompanied by acknowledgement or closure. It was simply accepted as progress. Lee Greenwood's journey from arena-level dominance to near obscurity highlights how unforgiving country music can be, even to artists once treated as untouchable. When the industry's priorities shift, even symbols can be left behind. Fame tied to a moment rarely survives beyond it. T.G. Sheppard. In the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, T.G. Sheppard was one of the most commercially dominant figures in country music. His run of chart success was relentless. Hit after hit climbed to the top, and his smooth, confident delivery made him a staple of radio playlists nationwide. At his peak, Sheppard wasn't just successful, he was unavoidable. His tours filled large venues, his name sold tickets, and Nashville viewed him as a proven engine of mainstream appeal. Sheppard's strength lay in his consistency. He understood the balance between pop accessibility and country credibility at a time when that balance paid enormous dividends. Promoters trusted him to draw crowds. Labels trusted him to deliver hits. For several years, his career operated at arena scale, sustained by an industry that rewarded reliability and broad appeal. But the very system that elevated him also made his fall invisible. As country music entered a new era, driven by shifting aesthetics and a younger, more aggressively marketed image, Sheppard's polished style began to feel anchored to a previous decade. There was no rejection, no public turning point. The industry simply recalibrated its focus, and his place within it quietly diminished. Radio was the first to move on. Airplay slowed, then faded. Without that exposure, tour offers changed in scope and scale. Arena dates became rare. Major promotional campaigns disappeared. Sheppard continued working, recording, and performing, but the infrastructure that once amplified his presence was gone. Nashville didn't sever ties. It simply stopped investing attention. What makes his story particularly stark is how quickly dominance can dissolve into absence. A few years separated his position at the top of the charts from his disappearance from mainstream conversation. New country fans encountered the genre without ever hearing his name, unaware that he once defined what success looked like. Sheppard didn't implode or self-destruct. He adapted as best he could, maintaining a professional career long after the spotlight faded. Yet adaptation couldn't replace relevance in an industry obsessed with novelty. His continued presence existed largely outside public awareness, sustained by loyal fans rather than cultural momentum. By the time his era was viewed as history, T.G. Sheppard had already been written out of the present. The sold-out arenas that once symbolized his success became distant memories. His journey illustrates how quietly country music can move on, even from artists who once embodied its commercial peak. T.G. Sheppard didn't lose everything because he failed. He lost it because the system that built him no longer needed what he represented. In country music, even sustained success can vanish without explanation. And when it does, the silence is complete. Mel McDaniel. For a brief but powerful stretch in the late 1970s and early 1980s, Mel McDaniel was exactly what mainstream country music wanted. His sound was upbeat, accessible, and perfectly aligned with radio at the time. His singles climbed the charts quickly, his albums sold reliably, and his shows drew crowds large enough to justify major venues. McDaniel wasn't a fringe success. He was part of the system, benefiting fully from Nashville's promotional machine. At his peak, Mel McDaniel's name carried commercial confidence. Radio programmers trusted him, labels invested in him, and promoters booked him knowing tickets would move. His music felt current, energetic, and commercially safe. For a moment, it appeared he had secured a long-term place in the upper tier of country music, supported by consistent exposure and steady audience demand. But unlike artists whose careers collapse under controversy or excess, McDaniel's decline followed a quieter path. As the genre evolved and the industry chased newer sounds and faces, his style began to feel tied to a fading moment. The shift wasn't dramatic. There was no public rejection. Instead, support gradually weakened. Singles received less airplay, promotional efforts softened, momentum stalled. The consequences arrived quickly once radio stepped away. Without constant rotation, the demand for large-scale tours disappeared. Arena bookings dried up. What remained were smaller venues and scattered appearances, far removed from the scale that once defined his success. McDaniel continued performing, but the infrastructure that had once amplified his career was no longer there. What makes his story especially stark is how little acknowledgement accompanied the transition. Mel McDaniel didn't receive a final chapter or a moment of recognition marking the end of his mainstream relevance. He simply faded from view. For newer audiences, his name barely existed. For the industry, he became part of a closed chapter without ceremony. By the time his era was openly discussed as history, McDaniel had already been absent from the spotlight for years. His songs survived among longtime fans, but his presence in country music's broader narrative had vanished. The arenas that once filled at his name became memories rather than expectations. Mel McDaniel's journey from sold-out venues to obscurity highlights the speed with which relevance can disappear in country music. Success built on alignment with the moment rarely survives beyond it. When the industry moves forward, it seldom looks back. And for artists like McDaniel, the fall isn't loud.